You're listening to the Religion Unplugged podcast. I'm Matthew Peterson, editor of the show. In recent years, Christian nationalism has become a ubiquitous term in American political discussion. It is said by many with fear and loathing, and by others with great excitement and conviction. Among the enthusiasts include Doug Wilson, who is the pastor of Pete Hegseth, the United States Secretary of War. And it's not just Hegseth who has ties to the ideology. Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House of Representatives, has also been described as a Christian nationalist. And many members of Trump's administration and the pro-Trump media have flirted with the idea that Christians, and maybe more accurately, the Bible, ought to be the guiding force behind the government's actions. Last month, Trump hosted Rededicate 250, an event which sought to, in the administration's own words, rededicate America as one nation under God. But as much as Christian nationalism has become an emotional buzzword, the belief system it describes has varied over time, and the current MAGA-adjacent evangelical iteration is only a small piece of the story of how Christianity and American society have pushed and pulled on each other for centuries. As we recognize the U.S.'s 250th birthday, the question of whether or not America is a Christian nation or whether or not it was intended to be one continues to show its face in social media feeds, newspapers, podcasts, pulpits, and schoolrooms. So, to sort through the complicated relationship between Jesus and Uncle Sam, Religion Unplugged's culture critic, Joseph Holmes, sat down with three American Christian professors, Matthew Parks, Joseph LeConte, and David Corbin. The group discusses whether or not the U.S. is a Christian country, whether that's even possible, and to what extent Christian beliefs ought to influence political decisions. Here's Joseph, Matt, Joe, and David.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Hello, everyone. I'm Joseph Holmes, film and culture critic for Religion Unplugged, and with me today we have three very special guests. Tell us each a little bit about yourselves. Joe, let's start with you. Then Matthew, then David.
Okay. Well, I am an author, educator, and filmmaker. I've been kind of a roving professor since the closure of the King's College. You know, whoever will have me for a period teaching, trying to defend what's left of Western civilization. I'll just leave it at that.
And I'm Matt Parks. I was a professor at King's as well, longtime educator, and currently president of a small software development company.
And David Corbin, likewise a King's College professor and currently at the Colorado Christian University as its provost, and loving Colorado, as you can see in the background here, and somewhat loving my commutes into Denver every day in Colorado Springs. But Joe, great to be with you. Just great to be with you today, and looking forward to this.
Yeah, all three historians extraordinaire who all were my professors at the late King's College, and definitely highly influenced me with their discussions on history and philosophy and all that stuff. So I benefited greatly from both all their wisdom and foolishness. So you can definitely credit them with a lot of the commentary that you see today. But anyway, I'm really excited to have you all on, your perspectives as historians on the nature of the question as to whether America is a Christian nation. For most of my given context, for most of my life, I've seen, Americans on either side debate this. The argument typically revolves around, the founders, how Christian were they, how much of their faith is tied up in the binding documents of the Declaration of Independence and Constitution, but how much, and also like how much the level of Christian religiosity of the general population is. But the reason this is interesting is that nobody is having this debate as just an academic exercise. It's kind of this, America is or is not a Christian nation. Therefore it says something about like what America should be. The White House recently hosted a prayer gathering at the National Mall called Rededicate 250, aimed at rededicating America to God with, as NPR noted, very little participation from other faiths. Meanwhile, Texas State Representative James Tallarico, who's recently become somewhat famous or infamous, depending on who you ask, for being a politician who strongly advocates for a more progressive form of Christianity. He said, America is not a Christian nation. It's a nation where you are free to be a Christian, Muslim, Jew, Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, agnostic, or atheist. So, Matt and David, I want to start with you because you actually host a podcast together called Democracy in America Today, where you look kind of historically at kind of American political thought and practice. So I wanted to ask, when did we historically begin seeing this debate about whether America is a Christian nation start, and how was this debate sort of similar or different from what we see today?
Well, I mean, I think in some ways the debate's been there from the start, but a lot of that has to do with definitions. I mean, I think you've, already introduced some potential differences of definition, what we mean by a Christian nation. Are we talking about a nation that is predominantly Christian, at least in terms of outward profession? Are we talking about a nation whose principles are grounded in biblical norms, biblical kind of human nature, things of that sort? Are we talking about a nation that should have established churches at the state level or even at the national level? So those debates were there from the start. I mean, if you look at early state constitutions, we've just been going through this on our podcast, you see that there were many of them that required office holders to be professing Christians of one sort or another. There were established churches into the early 19th century in New England, although most of the southern and middle states got rid of that at the time of the founding. So probably depends on what you mean by definition. I mean, the Scottish Covenanters, right down almost to the present day, believe that our document should acknowledge Jesus as Lord over the United States. So, we've had this debate in various forums from the very beginning. I think, probably the best way to get into it today is going to be to try to work towards some understanding of what we mean by a Christian nation, and then we can work from there to an analysis of where we actually stand vis-a-vis that definition.
Yeah, and I would just add that I think that, and you mentioned this earlier, Joseph, in introducing the whole question, that, this is definitely a debate today, but is it truly a debate, or is it a means to sway other people one way or the other ideologically? Ideological types, which are very present in political discourse today, they're not trying to end up at the truth. They want to use whatever argument they can make to make themselves stronger. So, I would agree with Matt that it's always good with a difficult question like this to answer in 2 words. It depends. So, what do you mean by a Christian nation, and then go from there.
Yeah. So, Joe, one of the things, you have a new documentary out about the American founding father, Benjamin Rush. And one of the things that you emphasize in there is his Christian faith and how that influenced his understanding of the kind of nation he was trying to help found. So I want to get sort of move back to this question of, okay, how should we define a Christian nation and what does that look like? But I want to start kind of with you. How did your understanding, as you were doing research on this figure, how did he seem to understand what it would mean to be, the kind of nation he was trying to build based on his faith and principles? And how was that interacting with the other visions at the time?
Yes, excellent question, Joseph, and thank you. Great to be with you all, guys. I think Benjamin Rush, and just a quick reminder, Rush, he signs the Declaration of Independence. He's chief surgeon in Washington's Continental Army. He's a player in the Continental Congress. He's a strong advocate for women's education. He's a leader in the field of psychiatry, and he's an abolitionist and a man of faith. He's a remarkable guy, and I think in a lot of ways he embodies the American story and how Americans are thinking about this nation that they're trying to found and the role of religion in that nation. So here's how Rush is so fascinating. When he was charged with helping to draft a constitution for the state of Pennsylvania, during that whole revolutionary period, he's battling with other members there in the Pennsylvania delegation who want to have a religious test for public office. And Benjamin Rush says, no religious test. If a man's morals are good, he should not be excluded from public life, public office. And Rush is a believer. He's a Trinitarian. He's a member of the Presbyterian Church. So there's that Benjamin Rush. But at the same time, Benjamin Rush also says this, and this is, I think, in one of his essays. He had gotten to a back and forth with John Adams on the future of the Republic. It is back in 1805. Where's it going? What's the state of affairs? And I think Rush's answer to that question posed to him by Adams, here's part of the answer. He says, this divine book, meaning of the Bible, favors that equality among mankind, that respect for just laws, and all those sober and frugal virtues which constitute the soul of republicanism. The Bible constituting the soul of republicanism. And in that essay, it's the Bible as a school book. That's the title of the essay. He wants to see the scripture as part of the curriculum, particularly in terms of morals, the whole ethical framework of the scriptures. Not so much teaching doctrine, theological doctrine per se, but the moral teaching of scripture, both from the Old Testament and the New Testament. So that's how Rush, I think, is trying to kind of splice it, right? On the one hand, we've got to be a people who are committed to the deep moral truths of Christianity, acknowledging God, the God of the universe. But on the other hand, a separation of church and state, not a theocracy. I don't know what Rush would have said if you'd asked him, is America a Christian nation? I'm not sure he would have known what to do with that phrase. And I'm kind of like Rush that way. I know what a Christian is. I know what a Christian church is. And I think I know what a Christian college is, having taught at one. But beyond that, I can't go any bigger than that, you know?
So this is really interesting to me.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. You go first, Dave.
I mean, I like that, Joe, because I think that when you look at the different famous revolutions that take place at the end of the 18th century, and you compare the American Revolution with the French Revolution and who was fighting in the French Revolution.
Yeah.
In the French Revolution, you have the traditionalists who grab onto some level of dependence and authority in the moral sphere, but they also make the claim that politically that traditional authority ought to remain in power. And those that are trying to revolt against the king and the aristocrats make the case that, no, we need political independence, but we're not going to get to political independence unless we also have moral independence from the idea of God and his sovereignty over the world. But in America, there's an interesting hybrid, and Tocqueville goes into this, that you see a blending of dependence within the moral sphere and a desire for independence within the political sphere. And I think Tocqueville notes that this is kind of key to unlocking what was unique about the American democratic republic, that hybrid between moral dependence and political independence.
Interesting.
Okay, so I want to kind of summarize this. I think you guys have said some really interesting things and see if this tracks. You know, as you said, Matt, from a historical perspective, in a sense, you can say this debate has always been a part of America, because you had the people saying, well, should we have a state church? You know, should we have a state church or should we not? And in a sense, that question of, okay, you know, are we going to have an established religion in our country or are we not, is a question of, you know, are we going to be a Christian nation? The thing is, it was mostly a fight between Christians, just because most of the people at the time were Christians of some sort. Certainly by today's standards, most of us would consider them Christians. Like your spectrum was like, you know, do you believe, you know, in Jesus was God, you know, in Trinity versus, you know, not, you know, but so there's that aspect. It only kind of, if as America becomes more secular and there are fewer people who would avow themselves as Christians, then you start to say, you know, between a fight between Christians maybe and non-Christians. Yeah. But the other thing is that fight of like, well, okay, what does it mean to be a Christian nation was there, because you say, does that mean it's going to be institutionally a Christian nation, or is it going to be a Christian nation based on the population being a Christian and their values being a part of that equation? Yeah. Which I think is very interesting. I guess then the question becomes for you guys, you know, I guess this is sort of two parts in a sense, but one is, would you say you would define, you know, is a nation that has Christian population and Christian values, and where those Christians are allowed to imbue their values into the government in some way, still a Christian nation or not? And I guess then what's the line between putting your values into a place and creating any sort of that separation of church and state?
Well, I mean, I think I'm with Joe on this question of whether there's such thing as a Christian nation. I think that's categorically probably a false term. There are things that have individuals have a profession of faith, and schools can have a profession of faith that we all agree to, and churches have a confession, but nations don't. Or at least nations shouldn't, because they don't actually embody a collective judgment on these questions. We know that at a very ground level, there is no nation that is 100% Christian or 100% Muslim or anything else. So I think that's part of the challenge here. I think for us, what we want to say is that, of course, there's been a deep influence of Christianity on the American story. The American church has been critically important in many ways as a civic institution, leaving aside obviously the spiritual influence of the church. And so all of that, we want to certainly recognize and celebrate. I think sometimes we get into this debate about, what's a proper argument in the public square, and we're kind of cowed by the John Rawls and kind of the sort of liberal approach to this. Say, well, we can't bring any kind of a moral claim into the public square. We go back to the old fact-value distinction of the early 20th century and say, well, we can talk about the facts, we can't talk about values. I don't want to use the word value, because I think what we have in biblical terms is a category of nature. And nature is a universal teacher. Nature points to universal principles. We don't have to argue for anything that's a distinctively Christian position. Let's say on the issue of abortion, we can talk about nature. We can talk about things that are evident to all people, that God has revealed in his design, in the way that he governs the universe, that don't require us to quote this particular passage from the New Testament or the Old Testament. So I think that's really the foundational common ground for public discourse that brings moral categories properly into that discourse without having to make it subjective in terms of these are the things that I value, or smell of theocracy, where I'm imposing my religion in some particular way upon you.
Yeah. If I can jump in there, and we want to hear from David Corbin, let me compliment what Matt just said. I think what Matt's getting at is the idea of natural law. I mean, if the American Revolution is a natural rights revolution, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, John Locke, you guys knew I was going to quote John Locke eventually. John Locke would have said, life, liberty, and property, right? These inalienable rights. Well, you can't have natural rights without natural law undergirding it. So in terms of where do you try to legislate, whether you're coming from an explicitly Christian perspective or Jewish perspective. I want to bring in our Jewish friends on this as well, the Judeo-Christian inheritance that we have. Can we find that common ground based on natural law about what does it mean to be human, the nature of human sexuality, the nature of the family? There are some decisions we can make, some pieces of legislation we can even get behind that are rooted in this older idea of natural law and natural rights. But that's a discussion we have to have, don't we? Because it's just kind of out the window. And you talk to people about natural law and their eyes will just glaze over, won't they? But it's not really that complicated to have that conversation. We just need to have it. We just need to have it like we're having it right now.
Yeah, and I would say coming out of the 17th century and the religious wars of the 20th century between different Christian sects within the West, is when the modern state begins its march forward. And initially, modern states all across Western Europe and then in North America were making claims that, will allow for some level of neutrality. We'll be neutral on a lot of these questions. I think one of the challenges Matt had said, and Joe, you're relating to too, that we can't talk about these things in the public square, that we have to be morally indifferent to things that we morally care about, which is ridiculous. Why wouldn't we care about the most important things? What does it mean to be a human being? What is justice? What is right? What is goodness? Yes. And Christianity and Judeo-Christianity has a lot to say about these things, and has formed us, albeit imperfectly, to speak into these issues in a way that I think is for the betterment and the flourishing of mankind.
Yes.
But if we're not allowed to speak, if we're not allowed to engage, if we're told right off the bat that our faith is excluded from the public square, that's where we have the issues that we have today. And then we have a reaction against it But I think in our reaction against it, we ought to aim to a true understanding of what the modern state should be doing and should not be doing relative to these questions.
Yes, and just jumping in quickly, there's a reason that Moses adorns the frieze there on top of the Supreme Court building, the 10 Commandments. There's a moral law. That's why Mr. Tallarico down there in Texas, who opposes the posting of 10 Commandments in the public schools, I think he needs to do a little more historical legwork. The entire Western canon, the legal canon, is built on what? That moral law given to us by Moses. That's why the Jewish aspect is so crucial as well as we talk about the role of Christianity in America. I mean, let's not forget how those revolutionaries and American founders regarded the Jewish religion with great reverence, and that great debt they owed to the Jews: monotheism, the moral law, God's purposes for mankind. This is pretty heavy stuff.
I think this is really interesting, and it gets to kind of this difficulty in creating really hard dividing lines, because on the one hand, you say, look, we want to have some level of neutrality, and people oftentimes miss this. Again, I have conversations with some of my friends who lean a bit more Christian nationalist, who I will say to them, frankly, you can have all the great theory you want, but if you problem with trying to turn back the clock is that history repeats itself. Like, there is a reason that we made these changes, which is we didn't want to go back to Protestants and Catholics and even just sects of Protestants killing each other. We said, hey, let's limit the number of things we kill each other over. How about that? How about we start with that? And so there is this pragmatic development that's been happening within Christian civilization at the time that the founding of America happened, where you say maybe we can separate the institutions of church and state, thus that maybe we don't legislate certain things, so that we can, again, limit the number of things we kill each other over.
Yes.
On the flip side, as you point out, though, Joe, most of the things that we consider to be values that we would legislate are historically bound by the history of being influenced by Christian or Judeo-Christian, want to say, understanding of the world. And so it's hard to divorce those two things. I had a conversation online, which is always the best place to have a deep discussion.
Right.
It's online.
Highly recommended.
With an acquaintance of mine who I've worked with in the past. And she was very strongly, she said, like, no, we are not allowed. She's a Christian. She's like, we're not allowed to make any laws based on Christian values. We can only make laws based on universal values. And I said to her, frankly, my dear sister in Christ, you're a feminist. Your values aren't even universal in our country. Like, you absolutely believe in, in imposing your Christian values. They just happen to be 20th century mainline Protestant Western values on other people, and you don't call them Christian. But the problem is, again, on the flip side, I'm going to talk about, Aaron Sorkin, who wrote in The West Wing. He had these very specifically Jewish characters talk about one of their objections to, things like the Pledge of Allegiance, things like these, is that it pushed them to the side of the American story and American communities and the American way of life. And I think one of the things that you see in these conversations is a debate between whose values, whose expression of those values get to be at the center of the American culture, value, and story, and get to be celebrated and expressed without people objecting to it, getting a veto power. Because you were talking about, David, about how, look, as Christians, we ought to be able to publicly and openly in the center of American life get to express and advocate for our values like anyone else. And we feel oftentimes that we're being excluded from that. We can only talk about our values, in a sense, if it's in a morally neutral way, like using natural law or reality, things like that. We can only do that. But on the other hand, non-Christians, I was saying, no, we want to say America is a secular nation because they don't want to be pushed to the side of who and what America should be. Again, as is pointed out in the NPR article, the Trump rally is it's like bring America back to God, but okay, it's very clearly a specific God based on who's elected and who's allowed to there. What is that line between America as a Christian nation, and you would say, in the Benjamin Rush tradition, that's still, Christianity and those values are still forward in a sense, but not in a sense that it pushes other people out in a wrong way. Like what's the right kind of Christian nation versus wrong way when the lines are so blurry?
Wow. Big question, which I can only take a stab at, and these gentlemen will have to correct my errors. Let me quote here from James Madison. And Madison, of course, is involved with Jefferson in pushing against the idea of established churches. This is his memorial and remonstrance. But listen to what Madison says in this tract arguing against an establishment of religion in the state of Virginia. He says, our duty to worship God, this duty is precedent both in order of time and in degree of obligation to the claims of civil society. Before any man can be considered as a member of civil society, he must be considered as a subject of the governor of the universe. Wow. Mm-hmm. So the idea that there's a moral law, it comes from God, and we need to honor that law. I think that's something that government can do up to a point. On allowing expressions of civil religion, as we do, one nation under God, that acknowledgement of a supreme being. We are accountable. Government itself is accountable to a supreme being. I think that's a good thing for government to underscore, to support up to a point, civil society. More explicit than that, that's the role, it seems to me, then, of the private sector, to make its claims. If you want to have a rally on the mall about rededicating, America to God, okay, have the rally, but keep the government officials mostly out of it, would be my argument. Yeah. Let the private sector make those arguments for a specific expression of faith.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. There's forgot the author's last name. His first name is Aaron, but there's a book on kind of modern evangelical thought, and he makes the case that it's really quite interesting when you take a look at the last 50 or 60 years in American history. Aaron Renn, Aaron Renn, exactly.
Yes, Life in the Negative World, yes.
Life in the Negative World, and I think this is where we're going to right now, that at a certain point you had this moral majority, right, the 70s and 80s Republican politics, and then you got into this era of neutrality around the 90s, and an important hinge point, oddly enough, I think, is 9/11 to a lot of American history. A lot changes, after 9/11. But going into the later aughts and teens, we begin to move into this negative environment where being an evangelical is made more difficult because you're not heard out, right, for wanting to share the gospel. If you are a Christian, there's something wrong with you. There's something that ought to be attacked. And I think that our response as Christians ought not to want to take that negative antagonism against us and then be reactive and antagonize against the other. Because I think that if we're doing that, we're getting caught in this spiral of downward spiral of vengeance and incivility and all the rest. And we're actually not showing ourselves, right, to be true to our faith, in which we want liberty and justice for all, and we find the rationale, the moral foundation for that liberty and justice for all in our faith.
Yes.
I mean, the church has flourished under conditions that were, from a secular standpoint or a civil standpoint, very difficult. I mean, the early days of the Christian church, as the church is expanding and facing severe persecution in the Roman Empire and on many other contexts, there's nothing really unusual about our situation. It's unusual on American soil, perhaps, given the history of the colonial period up to the present day. But if the American church is going to be a minority that's going to struggle in the public square, well, we've been there before, but that will be okay, and we don't need to try to recapture some, bygone age or assert political power in order to fight this great struggle as if that struggle is the struggle of Christ. The ultimate victory of Christ's kingdom is not going to come through whatever happens in the 2026 midterms or the 2028 presidential election or any election thereafter.
Yeah. And quickly jumping in here, gentlemen, and great comments. This goes back to David's earlier point about the French Revolution versus the American Revolution. Why did the French Revolution fail? Why did it collapse into tyranny? Within a decade, they were crowning an emperor for life. And compared to the American Revolution, I think what you had uniquely in this revolution, in this constitutional order, is you're bringing together, yes, the faculty of reason. These are Enlightenment guys, the Americans, but it's not the French Enlightenment. It's the Scottish American Enlightenment, which was generally speaking is friendly to religious belief. So there's the use of reason, but then there's the respect for revelation. The revelation of the Jewish scriptures and the Christian scriptures. So reason and revelation produced the American Revolution. It doesn't become unhinged. There's a recognition that at the end of the day, there's a loving and just God at the center of the universe to whom we are accountable. There's a moral law. There's natural law. So the Americans are able to bring together these different streams of thinking in a way no other revolution has done, I think, in the history of the world. Reason, revelation, and revolution. And so I think that's really crucial to understanding how you move forward. We've got to continue to rely on reason, on natural law arguments. We got to reach people outside the Christian faith. We got to speak their language, appeal to their sense of justice, compassion, etc. But also, we should be free to say, hey, there's a source for that. There's a transcendent source of that. And who has done a better job as an historian of reminding us of that than Tom Holland in his book Dominion? We're so awash in Christian morality, the remnants of it, we don't even recognize it anymore. That's an educational task that some of us are still, engaged in.
Yeah, agreed.
I want to highlight a couple of things here and then give you time for some last words. I think if one of you hadn't brought up Tom Holland, I was going to, because it's interesting study that was done recently that talked about America's view of morality, and that basically every American defines morality the same way, as you need to protect victims from harm. Now, where the political cultural divides come in is who's defined as the victim in a hierarchy of victims. Again, let's just looking at the issue of abortion is so obvious for this. Who is the victim? Is it the, unwed mother, or is it the baby? That's just and which victim gets priority, but it all universally is you have to protect the victim from harm. And that is the most, biggest example to me of how Jesus conquered the world, so to speak, that's how we define whether something is immoral or not. And so I think, on the one hand, we need to, the Christians who are advocating for, this is a Christian nation, they have a point to the degree that they're trying to say, look, you as a modern person need to have some degree of gratitude for the world you live in existing because of this historic nature of this. And perhaps if you want the good stuff to continue, maybe you want to be a part of that story, or at least give that story a space, even a privileged space within discourse. This is, again, one of the reasons I hear some Christians saying, oh, well, if they were real Christians, they would put Jesus, Beatitudes up there rather than Moses' 10 Commandments. I'm like, you don't get the argument. We're making a historical argument here, not a Christian nationalist argument there. But that's a whole other thing. But on the other hand, sort of the secularists have a point when they say, actually, what binds us together as a political body is space for people who are not Christians to also participate, and different kinds of Christians to also participate in this political life and be protected in that way. And so if you're saying that, legally and politically, non-Christians don't have that right to participate, then you are you're not choosing a Christian nation. You're choosing a particular kind of Christian nation, which the founders rejected because of, again, historical avoiding people trying to kill each other. And I think to your point, Joe, historically, America's version has been better for Christianity because we are the only Western rich nation in the world that has actually had a flourishing religious population
Yes.
In our history. Again, we've been secularizing much slower than other places.
Yes.
So
Yes.
now I want to give each you a chance to kind of what would be the final thoughts that we haven't dealt with so far in this question. If somebody still has lingering questions about, what it means to be a Christian nation and whether we are it, how would you wrap this up in a way that we haven't talked about before? Joe, let's start with you and then move to Matt and then David.
Okay, it's a huge question. We'll just take a stab at it. I'm going to give my colleagues here a chance to chime in and correct my errors. I think there's a lot here from John Locke that I think is really important, because his letter on toleration is such a profound statement of how do you achieve social peace, some cohesion in a multicultural, multi-religious context. That's what he's trying to negotiate. And near the end of the letter, he says, the sum of all we drive at, where this whole thing is going, is that every man enjoy the same rights as every other man, equal justice under the law. And then he names all kinds of religious groups, the most despised religious minorities in Europe at the time, the Quakers, for example, the Baptists. He talks about Jews, Muslims, equal justice under the law. He says to deny them that's not the gospel. So he's making both a natural law argument and a Christian argument for that religious pluralism. So I think the key here is equal justice. Everybody has the same rights to engage in public life. No one is treated differently because of their religious beliefs. Now, having said that, I do want to affirm that there is a moral law that is so tied to who we are as human beings, an anthropology, if we use a $25 word. What does it mean to be human? We've got to recover common ground that we've lost on what it means to be human. There are not 10 genders. We've got to come back to a common understanding, and that's going to be the art of persuasion and education.
That's great. I really appreciate that, Joe. And I guess I would say to anybody who's concerned about this question is, why are you concerned about the question? Why is it important that we either say America is or is not a Christian nation? Is it because as a Christian you're concerned about losing your place, losing your power, using what you think of as kind of a traditional voice or leadership in the country? Well, that may be gone. And calling America a Christian nation isn't going to bring it back. Are you concerned about the blessings of Christianity for your neighbor? Great. Well, then go out and be a faithful member of your church.
Yes.
And be part of proclaiming the gospel to the nations. And all kinds of good things will happen.
Yeah.
It doesn't really require that the nation say one thing or another about that. Obviously, we want the freedom to meet and to gather and to declare the faith, but we don't need much more than that from the country. So I think that there might be more heat on this than is required. And what we can do as the church is all kinds of wonderful things, worshiping God and showing love to our neighbor. And the effects of that for the community will be palpable. Right? Obviously, the eternal salvation of individuals who actually come to faith, but then just the leavening influence of Christians and Christianity as it goes forth in all the normal ways. We don't need to fight for political authority in order to get those blessings. And probably, if we do fight for political authority, we're going to distract ourselves from the real work of the church. So we might end up with a Christian nation in a certain sense and have lost Christianity in the ultimate sense.
Yeah, in this conversation, and thank you, Joe, and thank you, Matt, for your comments, and thank you, Joseph, for having us on the show today. But it makes me think back to a book that came out around 2010 by the former St. John's president, John Agresto, titled Mugged by Reality. And Agresto had been commissioned to lead higher education in Iraq after the invasion. And he was very, very excited about going there, about sharing Judeo-Christian ideas in that part of the world and establishing a strong higher education system. And, what he found out and what he said once at a Princeton lecture is that It's not enough for us to love liberty. It's not enough to have a democratic republic in which people love liberty. What makes the difference between a democratic republic that flourishes and one that doesn't comes in loving your neighbor's liberty. Because we can love our own liberty, but it's a whole nother level to love our neighbor's liberty. And I think this kind of wraps up a lot of what we've been saying. Yes, the Judeo-Christian tradition teaches us at our core not simply to be about ourselves, not to be arrogant, but to be humble, to recognize our imperfection, and to grant with civility and with generosity a love for another and the situation that they're in as well. I think that's Christ. It doesn't mean there isn't capital T truth. There is, but that capital T truth leads us to recognize our own imperfections, and because of that, to walk more humbly with the Lord as we deal with other people.
Well said. Well said.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you all so much for joining me today. I hope that this conversation has added more light and less heat and helped everyone, listeners, to navigate this more fully. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, David. And thank you, listeners, for joining us. I'm Joseph Holmes. This is Religion Unplugged, your one-stop shop for all the best religious news and culture.
Thank you for listening to the Religion Unplugged podcast. If you'd like to hear more from our guest today, you can listen to the Democracy in America Today podcast, which is hosted by David Corbin and Matt Parks. Joseph LeConte has written several books, but he is most well known for his writing on C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, the most recent of which was 2025's The War for Middle-earth. All of that can be found in the description below. If you like the podcast, please consider rating and reviewing us on your podcast platform, subscribing to Religion Unplugged on YouTube, and sharing our work with friends or on social media. Religion Unplugged's reporting and analysis is brought to you by real people like me, not AI. If you appreciate the work we do here at Religion Unplugged and want to keep this show ad-free, please consider making a donation. Now is a particularly good time to give, since from now through August 17th, your gift will be doubled. Thanks again for listening, sharing, and giving. We'll be back next week with a brand new episode of the Religion Unplugged podcast.